Well, hello there. This is Bradley again, and you're listening to another episode of Psi Chi's podcast, Psych Everywhere. For Black History Month, we thought that we would specially host an episode that's not just about the history of persons of color, but more specifically, the history of persons of color in the field of psychology. So today, I have the honor of interviewing, via Zoom, Dr. Stephen O. Roberts, who is in the Department of Psychology at this little-known school called Stanford University. So in 2020, Dr. Roberts was the author of an article called Racial Inequality in Psychological Research, Trends of the Past and Recommendations for the Future. So the authors for that article, they analyzed 26 empirical articles published in major cognitive, developmental, and social psychology journals between 1974 and 2018.
26,
did I say 26?
Yeah.
26,000, that's right.
Yeah, big difference.
That was fun. I said that and I was kind of like, I had my eye on him a little. I was like, let's see how he, 26,000. So the goal of this article was to see how often important issues of race were discussed. And further, and I'm going to quote this exactly from the article, the goal was to examine whether people who edit, write, and participate in the research are systematically connected. Welcome to the show, Dr. Roberts. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to be here. And as a former student Psi Chi member myself, this is a great honor. So thank you for reaching out.
Absolutely. So I got to ask, how long does it take to track 26,000 articles?
I think it took maybe about 4 or 5 months, to be honest. But this was 4 or 5 months of 2 people working on it full time. So it was, a lot of hours. And fun fact, what, readers of that paper probably won't know is we built the data set, and then after the paper was accepted, I was kind of shocked that it was accepted, to be honest with you, because it's kind of critiquing psych research. So we rebuilt the data set again from scratch. So that time we did it really fast in about a month or 2. So wow. It took a long time, and we really made sure that it was as tight as possible.
Wow. So I see, I think 4 major issues that the article brings up. Too few person of color editors, too few person of color authors, too few person of color study participants, and then beyond that, too few articles that actually highlight person of color issues in the first place. Does that sound fair?
I think that's fair, but a point that I also want to emphasize, because people often look at this paper and think that we're arguing for, saying that 50% of the editors need to be people of color. That's not necessarily at all what we're saying, actually. One thing we're really focusing on, for instance, is the papers themselves. If, for instance, in one of the findings was that in cognitive psych, for instance, I think it was about 3,700 publications. If 100% of those papers have been edited by white scientists, then that's a narrow, that's a problem. So it's about diversifying, who gets into these positions. Now, what the ideal rate is, that's an open question, but it's really about, finding ways to include people, especially people of color, across all those levels, especially the powerful positions. Because, and I know I'm kind of ranting here, but, one of the, in addition to those 3 things, one of the key findings is that under white editors, there are significantly fewer papers published on race. So it's not necessarily, what we would argue systemic racism against people of color, but it's against the topic itself. So it's important to have people who care about different things in these positions. So it's about the people and it's about the content as well.
I guess it's a speculative question, but why do you think that is? Did they receive fewer of these articles? Did they accept fewer ultimately?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. We are currently doing a decent amount of experimental work on that. So in that paper, it's purely a descriptive, archival finding. So now the question is, well, why is that the case? And I think that there are at least 2 explanations. I think there are at least 3. but I'll talk about two. One is a problem on the reviewer's end. There's a ton of psych research making very clear that, especially in the United States, that people who are white tend to think about race and racism less often and less critically than people who are of color. And the reason is, if you're completely, if you feel the weight and magnitude of something, then you're going to be very attentive to that thing. So if you are seemingly not affected by it, I think white people are affected by racism in ways that, that's one of the big problems of how do we get everyone to acknowledge that. But if something is not important to you, then if you receive research that is on that issue, I think that you may be motivated to say that this is not important. And we do have experimental work that we're working on that we need to write up soon on if you present white people, use white people and black people, but if you present these samples with research, the exact identical research, one for half the participants, they get the research with black people. It's the participants are black. The other half the participants are white. The exact same research that has nothing to do with race. It's about depression or something. The white participants, not the black participants, will say that the research with the white samples is better, more publishable than the research with the black samples. There's just a devaluing of that research. So that's one problem on the reviewer's end. I think there's another problem, not necessarily a problem, because I guess it's a strategy on the submitter's end, the researcher's end. And we have experimental evidence on this as well, such that journals that have mostly white editorial boards, what they signal to scientists who do work on race, irrespective of their identity, what it signals to them is that they probably don't care about this stuff. They don't value this stuff. So I'm actually going to submit my stuff somewhere else. And we have experimental work with, I think, about 1,500 psych PhD students to demonstrate that that is actually, in fact, what happens. But people who don't do research on race, they're like, oh, I'll submit my stuff there anyway. So that lack of diversity that, having mostly white editors, that has implications for the reviewer end and the submitter end, and has implications for a whole bunch of other stuff, we could talk about for days.
Interesting. So, of your findings in the article, did anything in particular surprise you, or go against what you had expected, or what the literature told you to expect, maybe?
Yeah, so I think that there was a lot. I think that whole paper surprised me in many ways. I think that finding that the overwhelming majority of papers are, well, first of all, let me backtrack, because James Jones, a psychologist at the University of Delaware, published almost the identical paper, a similar paper in, I think, 1970 something, where he did a similar review and basically demonstrated a lot of what we demonstrated. So one thing that was surprising, that 50 years later in 2020, that much hasn't changed. So we haven't made that much progress. So that was surprising. It was surprising to me that we found that there were fewer papers on race under white editors. It's something that I've experienced or can intuitively predict. I know that other scientists of color can intuitively predict, but to actually see that and to see that run the model and see that p-value, I remember that moment. It was like, wow, okay, so it actually happens. And then a whole bunch of other stuff, to see how how the race of the author predicts the race of the sample, which makes sense. But to see that statistically, people have made these arguments for a long time, but to actually have the data there, it was not surprising, but also surprising.
I see. So the three fields that were studied were, let me make sure I get it right. The three were cognitive, developmental, and social. And so when I look at the article, there's some charts showing over time, and you can see social and development get a little better, but cognitive, for whatever reason, stays it looks like pure zero all the way across. Why do you think that is? Why is that one staying behind?
Yeah, so in cognitive, we find that since 1974, since when we first started the first batch of papers, up until 2018, which I think is when we ended, 100% of the papers have been edited by white editors, and basically there have been, out of 3,700, I think it was 14 papers that gave race kind of formal treatment. Okay, so why is that? I mean, I think there are many reasons. We should get some cognitive psychologists in here and ask them to, explain themselves, put the interrogation light on them. I think that one is, cognitive psychology, I think, has a tricky and ugly history when it comes to race. If you think about the earliest, IQ testing and a lot of the psych theory and work that motivated eugenics movements here and in the United States, a lot of that was perpetuated by psychologists. Talk about Stanford, by Stanford psychologists. Lewis Terman is a big one. David Starr Jordan, for whom our psychology building was named after until a few months ago, played a huge role in that. So I think that cognitive psychologists may have maybe overcorrected and say, look, we're going to completely not touch that because we haven't had a good history with that. But I think that cognitive psychologists it would be useful to understand that, you can do work on the reality of race and racism and race as a social concept in ways that do not touch the nasty history of race being this biological hierarchy or whatever, So I think that plays a huge role in it. I think also another thing that plays a role in it is, who is in cognitive psychology. If most of the, psychologists of color who care about these issues tend to be in social psych or developmental psych and are less often in cognitive psych and neuroscience, you're just not going to see maybe the people who have those issues at the front of their mind in that field to care about it. So
I see. So we've talked about editors and authors a bit. Let's talk about participants. Why do so many journal articles, even in these really prestigious journals, even with articles about race sometimes, end up with weird samples? And that, for anyone who's not familiar, weird stands for, I believe, white, educated, industrialized, rich. I forget, what's the D? Democratic samples. So my question is it really that difficult to acquire a diverse sample? Like, what's the problem there? Why does that seem to happen so often?
I think there are many problems. One, I think in the original weird paper, the W stands for Western, but I agree with you. In my mind, I think of it as white. Or white needs to be added in there. I think there are multiple reasons, and people have addressed this in different ways. One reason is who's doing the science and who's closest to those scientists. If we do work with at predominantly white institutions and we're relying on undergrad samples, then okay, we're going to end up with white people. I think there is honestly an implicit or an explicit devaluing of research with people of color. There's this paper that I've been trying to publish for literally 5 years now. 5 years on multiracial people. And without fail, every time we get reviews for this paper, one of the criticisms we get is, well, why should we care about this group? Why is that important?
They write this in the reviews?
No, verbatim. Wow. Verbatim. I mean, these reviewers are bold, especially when their identities are hidden. It licenses them to say some really problematic, dehumanizing stuff. So I think it's especially, this is maybe a side topic, but it's dehumanizing and offensive for scientists of color to repeatedly have to argue and say, you know what, research with these samples is important, and to fight just for that basic idea. So I think there's this norm or this belief in psychology and in science more broadly that work with people of color is not as valuable, and it's probematic. I think that is one of the big ones. And I think another big one is that journals often do not incentivize researchers to diversify their samples. When a reviewer has to review how strong a paper is, they often have to rate the paper for how theoretically forward or how theoretically impactful is this, how methodologically rigorous is it, how tight are the statistics. No attention to the sample. But if journals would now embed in their review process that would have force reviewers to evaluate the paper for how diverse is the sample, then papers that look at populations like Black people, the Native American population, multiracial people, those would get upvoted in a sense. They'll get more points, and samples that focus on the weird context, they'll get fewer points. I think there's just a norm in our science that doesn't value or prioritize work with those samples, and it's a problem.
So, what led you to this area of research?
It is related to the previous topic. We were
Uh-huh.
doing work on, long story short, we were doing work on how Black people think about race, and how specifically how Black people think about the legacy of slavery and how that plays a role in how Black people think about Blackness today. I mean, I thought they were some of the tightest experiments I've ever done in my life. They were great. We submitted them to this journal. Long story short, the editor and the reviewers came back. I mean, mostly the editor. The reviewers were actually positive, but the editor came back basically saying, this is not important. This is not meaningful. We don't care about this stuff. Do all this other stuff that has nothing to do with what this paper is about. And I was, really frustrated and honestly furious by that experience. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to deal with this for the rest of my career. So let's actually spend some time, spend a few months going through the history of these papers and see who publishes what and under what circumstances. So that's why we did that.
I see. And how do you think your views have changed over time? Obviously, they've sharpened because you've got more information, but anything in particular that stands out?
I think that a few years ago, I think when I was a younger, more optimistic PhD student, excited to enter this field, and I still do love it, and I think that it's one of the greatest jobs in the world. But I thought, you enter this field and you do science on these systemic inequalities, and you submit them to like-minded peers, and the work gets out, and we're all on the same page. And I think in the last few years, I've just been more sharply aware of how the exact same barriers that we try to criticize and dismantle in the work are the exact same barriers that we have to navigate in our own science. And it's especially frustrating when the people who are supposed to be the most forward thinking, the most aware of these issues, are in many ways the most deeply embedded within those issues. So that's what I've learned, that there's a long way to go. But I've also learned that, especially in how that specific paper has been received, that a lot of people are receptive to these issues, that a lot of people are willing to put in the work to change these issues. I've seen a few journals, Child Development took this paper to heart and did some policy changes. So I've also learned that people are willing to learn about these issues and make progress on them.
So your article talks about how journals, and then specifically how authors, can increase diversity in their published research. I'm wondering, what about readers? Is there anything in particular that they can do to show that there really is a demand for more diversity-related content?
That's a great question. Okay, one, I think readers can be sensitive of what outlets are they reading, what journals are they subscribing to. There's a lot of great work being done in quote unquote specialized race journals, Journal of Black Psych, Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, that I think are discredited in ways that are often unfair. So, read and subscribe to journals that are doing, the thinking about these issues really critically. And then who knows, maybe write a letter to your editor. If you see a paper, I just saw this paper, I'm not even going to mention the name. I'm not even going to mention the name or the author or the outlet because it's not even worth giving that attention. But I saw this paper that was so deeply problematic and offensive. And I could not believe that was published in this high impact journal. In cases like that, I think it would be great for readers to maybe shoot the editor an email and, hold people accountable for the stuff that they produce, because it has consequences. So readers have a lot of power. The secret behind the journal game is that these are money making machines. I mean, the whole journal, should probably be off the record, but the whole journal enterprise as we currently know it is probably going to collapse in the next 5 to 10 years. Readers have a lot of power. Journals are in the business of making money. If the readers say, hey, I'm not going to subscribe to this and not going to give you my money anymore, either as individuals or institutions, journals and the publisher specifically has no choice but to listen.
Right. So we've got just a couple minutes left. Real quick, I don't know if this needs to be said, but it feels like based on what you've said that it does. I usually do these interviews and I want to ask, what's the problem? Why is it a problem? And what can be done? Maybe we haven't talked about why it's a problem. Why does this matter? It seems like some people don't seem to get it. Why do articles and need to be more diverse?
Okay, so I think it matters on multiple levels. I mean, again, even for the scientists, I mean, if there are barriers that prevent some people from getting their science out there, it's a direct barrier to their career advancement. So, I mean, it's a structural problem. But I think the bigger piece of the problem is that I think psychologists are in a very unique position to address racism in the real world. One of my favorite examples of it, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, the doll studies, showing how young kids think about race and how segregation has certain consequences. That research was taken to the Supreme Court and helped desegregate schools. I mean, those are developmental psych studies that helped do that. But now the extent to which psychologists can reduce racism and inequality in the real world depends on the extent to which that work can even get out and be published to begin with, and who we're doing the research with. So if there's a barrier in our own field that prevents us from getting that work out, then the impact that we can have in the real world is completely undermined. So that's why I think it's important that if psychologists are really committed to changing racism and sexism and homophobia and all the isms and all the problems that you can think of in the real world, it is very important that we look at ourselves, because there's a lot happening within our own backyard that is preventing us from being as effective as we could be.
Okay. Well, it has been an honor to talk to you today. I've really
Likewise.
enjoyed it. I'm sure listeners are going to enjoy it as well. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
You just listened to another episode of Psych Everywhere. I hope you enjoyed the show and that you'll hit that subscribe button, if you haven't already done so. As you might know, Psi Chi has a lot of race-related educational content that you can use to better yourself or to share in your classrooms and so forth. Here's what's new. For Black History Month, we recently created a special Black History Month online resource. This webpage features all our race-related magazine articles, journal articles, podcast episodes, including this one, webinars, blog posts, and more, all in sort of a single convenient location. You can access this resource for free at www.psichi.org/Black History Month. I'll also include a link in the show notes for this episode too, so go check it out. Speaking of the show notes, a link to Dr. Roberts' article that we talked about today is also included. Okay, everyone. Oh wait, what's that? You're looking for a way to just really make my day better? Well, since you asked, I do have an idea about that. If you have a moment, please leave a review for the show at Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening to podcast. And thanks for asking and thanks for thinking about us. That's got to be my cheesiest request for reviews yet, am I right? Okay, everyone, that's all for now. Talk to you again soon. Copyright 2021. Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.